Ever have one of those moments in marriage where your wife does something so simple yet completely genius, and you stop and think, this is why comedians like Nate Bargatze exist? Yeah, that happened to me. She did this tiny, unassuming thing. I swear it opened my eyes to the subtle, slow burn humor of life that Nate makes look effortless. And of course, immediately realized I was the punchline. It started with something innocent. She moved one of my socks. Not just any sock. My favorite sock, the one I only wear when I'm trying to impress nobody. And she moved it 3 inches to the left. 3 inches, and suddenly I noticed everything about the house had changed slightly. The coasters weren't aligned perfectly. The remote was slightly off-center. She hadn't said a word, hadn't done anything dramatic, yet it was all hilarious if you looked at it the right way. And I'm sitting there thinking, this is art. This is storytelling. This is Nate Bargatze level comedy being performed silently in my own living room. Then she walks by and casually mentions, "Did you notice I rearranged your socks?" And that's when it hits me. This is exactly what Nate does. He notices the smallest, most ordinary things and turns them into these huge, ridiculous stories that somehow explain life. And now I'm standing there, realizing I've been living in the punchline this whole time. She's like a comedian without a microphone. I'm the unsuspecting audience, laughing and cringing at the same time. I try to respond like a husband would. I start explaining why I didn't notice the socks were moved. I give her all these reasons. I was busy, I was thinking, didn't even see the sock drawer. She just looks at me with that perfect mix of amusement and patience that only wives have. I know she's thinking, yep, this is exactly why he's the way he is. And the more she watches me overthink, the funnier it becomes. I'm literally providing the comedy material right there. Live unscripted. She does the next thing. She rearranges something else, not in a mean way, not as a trick. Just a tiny, harmless change. Suddenly, I'm narrating everything in my head like it's a stand-up routine. So my wife moved the blender 2 inches to the right, and now I realize my whole kitchen is a stage set designed to make me question my life choices. And it's absurd, it's relatable, and it's exactly how Nate sees the world. Every little action she does after that becomes a story. A misplaced mug, a slightly louder sigh, the way she folds the laundry in a way that communicates guilt and love at the same time. I swear, I start timing her like it's a comedy clock. I pause to absorb the ridiculousness of normal life, and suddenly I understand why Nate talks about things that seem insignificant. Because those small, ordinary moments, they're secretly hilarious. And my wife, she's a master teacher, giving me a master class in comedy without even trying. And the funniest part, I'm learning this while also being completely clueless, completely caught off guard, and completely in awe. Every joke is already happening around me, and I just have to notice it. I try to narrate it to the dog, to the cat, even to myself. Nothing compares to actually being in the middle of it. And just as I think I'm starting to catch on, she does the next thing. Nate starts the story by explaining that sometimes the smallest things in marriage can feel like major life events, and in this case, it all began with a sock. Not a lost sock, not a dramatic sock, just a single sock that had been moved 3 inches to the left. That's it. 3 inches. He says he walked past the drawer that morning, casually, without thinking, and then paused because something fell off. The sock wasn't where it was supposed to be. It was subtle, almost imperceptible. But suddenly, his entire mental landscape shifted. realized the room looked slightly different. The coaster on the coffee table was angled a degree clockwise. The remote was nudged ever so slightly. Even the mug on the counter seemed to mock him. And that's when it hit him. This was exactly the kind of small, ordinary thing Nate Bargatze turns into comedy. He had been living inside one of those punchlines without knowing it. He describes standing there, staring at the drawer, wondering if this was a test. He imagines that maybe all married people have this moment where they realize the humor, the absurdity, and the storytelling potential in the most mundane things. He starts recounting it to himself silently, like narrating a stand-up routine that only he can hear. So my wife moved the sock 3 inches, and now the whole universe feels like it's slightly off. He chuckles, but also feels a little intimidated because he knows this is the kind of comedy that sneaks up on you. It's observational, subtle, and relentless. Then he mentions the pause, the moment when he first considers saying something to his wife. He thinks, should I point out the sock? Should I act like nothing happened? Because either choice has consequences. If he says something, it's overreaction. If he says nothing, he's silently acknowledging her control over the universe of small details, which is probably worse. He decides to wait, to observe, and that's when the magic happens. As he watches her casually pass by, she doesn't even acknowledge the sock, doesn't give a hint of why it matters. And that's when Nate starts laughing inside. He sees the genius of it. The comedy isn't in the sock. It's in the way she makes him overthink a sock. He describes pacing slowly, narrating everything internally. He notices the angle of the toaster, the exact tilt of the paper towels, even the way the light reflects off the counter. Every tiny detail becomes material for a story because suddenly the ordinary is absurd. Nate realizes this is how he should always observe life, patiently, silently, noticing the ridiculousness hiding in plain sight. Every small action, even a sock moved slightly, carries layers of unintended humor, and he begins cataloging them like a field researcher of comedy. He imagines telling this story on stage. The audience will laugh not because of a dramatic event, because they recognize it, the subtle absurdity of normal life. He pauses, considering that this is why Nate Bargatze's comedy resonates. It's not about outrageous stunts or grand gestures. Smart, it's about noticing small, ordinary moments and presenting them in a way that makes the mundane hilarious. As he watches the sock, perfectly ordinary, perfectly moved, he thinks he's finally starting to understand why Nate can make a living laughing at life while he's still tripping over the punchlines in his own house. Just as he thinks he's fully grasped it, she walks by again, reaching for something else, completely innocuous, completely ordinary, and Nate's brain immediately starts spinning. Realizing this is far from over, Nate says the next thing he noticed after the sock incident was how marriage has this subtle, almost invisible way of turning ordinary life into comedy gold, and it's all happening without anyone saying a word. He explains that he started paying attention to tiny things, the coaster slightly off, center on the coffee table, the remote a fraction of an inch away from its usual spot, a mug tilted to just enough to suggest someone had been there before him. At first, he thought he was being ridiculous, like he was imagining these differences. But the more he looked, the more he realized it wasn't imagination. These tiny shifts were happening all the time. The universe was conspiring to make him notice, to make him think, to make him laugh, and maybe panic a little too. He walks the audience through a typical morning, observing every detail like a detective, except his only case is his own house. He notices the paper towels, the way the light hits the kitchen counter, even the angle of the toaster. None of these things matter to anyone else, but to Nate, they suddenly have meaning. And that's the genius of subtle comedy. Smart, it's not the big dramatic events that make people laugh. It's the way ordinary life slowly, quietly turns absurd when you start paying attention. He jokes that he began narrating everything internally. Like a stand-up routine no one else could hear, the coaster is tilted at a 3-degree angle. The remote is 6 millimeters to the left. The mug is mocking me silently. Thus, he realizes he's also observing himself in this process, which adds another layer. His reactions, confused, overthinking, panicked, are part of the story, and they're hilarious. He tries to fix things, adjust things, straighten things, and each time he does, it only makes the absurdity worse. He describes bending over to adjust a pillow, only to notice that the blanket's folds now look slightly different. Suddenly, he's spiraling into a chain reaction of observation, self-analysis, and internal commentary. He jokes that this is exactly how Nate Bargatze sees the world. Every small, ordinary act has layers of absurdity if you just slow down and notice. Then reflects on how this observation makes him a little paranoid. He starts thinking, did she do this on purpose? Or is it just natural chaos? Every tiny shift feels like a setup for a joke, and he's trapped in it, unable to turn off the comedy because he's both the observer and the subject. He notices the way she moves around the house, her gestures, her casual interactions with everyday objects, and realizes that all of it is material. He starts timing her movements, anticipating the next setup, and finds himself internally narrating it. She opens the cabinet, pauses. Now, the sock drawer will be slightly askew, and I will overreact. The key, Nate says, is the slow burn. It's not about noticing something and immediately laughing. It's about letting it simmer in your mind, observing the little absurdities of life, and then realizing just how ridiculous everything is when you look closely. He notices how the mundane becomes funny simply because it's constant and unavoidable, how marriage provides a never-ending source of material. And as he's watching, analyzing, narrating, knows the comedy isn't over yet, it's just quietly building, like tension before a punchline, waiting for the next ordinary, absurd moment to hit. Nate explains that once he started noticing the small, subtle things around the house, he realized he had become the live punchline in his own life. And that was where the real comedy began. He says the funniest part of marriage is that you don't have to try to be funny, you just have to exist and pay attention. Every little action he took, every thought he overanalyzed, and every confused expression became part of the story. His wife, without even trying, was the masterful audience. She didn't laugh, didn't scold, didn't overreact. She just observed, which made everything infinitely funnier. Nate jokes that it's terrifying and hilarious at the same time. She had this calm, knowing look, the kind that silently communicates, Faye, I see you, and you are ridiculous. And in that look, he found himself providing material for a comedy routine he hadn't signed up for, but couldn't escape. He starts describing a moment when he tried to explain his reaction to the sock and the tiny rearrangements. He says, I tried to sound reasonable. I said, I didn't even notice it. It's just a sock. And of course, she just tilted her head and gave him the look, which was infinitely more comedic than anything he could have said. Realized then the punchline wasn't the sock. The punchline was him standing there overthinking a sock while she silently orchestrated the absurdity. He jokes that this is the slowest, most subtle setup for humor. He's the character, she's the universe, and the audience is living room furniture, silently judging him. He describes how every small interaction became a live scene in a stand-up routine. She would fold a towel slightly differently, sigh when she walked past him, or place a coffee mug a millimeter off center. He would immediately start narrating in his head, she's setting up the next punchline. I better watch my step. And every time he attempted to respond logically, failed spectacularly. He says, the more I explained, the funnier it became, because the audience, the wife, already knew what was going to happen. I was just providing commentary for my own embarrassment. Nate notices that part of the genius here is timing. Comedy is all about timing, and his wife had mastered it without a microphone, without lights, without a script. Every pause, every glance, every subtle movement had comedic timing baked in. He says he started watching the clock in his head. Okay, she moved the coaster at 7:03, the mug at 7:05. Now she's about to sigh. What will happen at 7:06? He was like a detective and a comedian all at once, trying to piece together the absurdity of normal life while also being the subject of it. He starts narrating more internally, imagining a stand-up set. So my wife moves a sock 3 inches to the left, and immediately I question my entire existence. And now the coffee mug is judging me. He laughs at the mental image, but also can't help overanalyzing the next possible move. Every action she takes becomes material. Every reaction he has adds layers to the joke. He's self-aware, embarrassed, and entirely part of the comedy at the same time. And just as he begins to think he's starting to grasp the pattern, she does something completely ordinary, perfectly timed, completely absurd, and Nate knows, without a doubt, that he's about to provide the next segment in this ongoing, real-life, unintentional comedy special. Nate explains that after realizing he was the punchline, he began noticing the subtle ways his wife was teaching him the art of observing comedy in everyday life. It wasn't about doing anything dramatic or saying clever lines. It was in the way she interacted with the world around her, with objects, routines, and even him. He noticed how she folded the laundry, a movement so casual yet precise that it seemed to communicate a mix of judgment and affection. He started paying attention to how she stacked dishes, how she lined up the condiments on the counter, how she moved slightly to make space for him to pass, and suddenly, each small gesture seemed like a perfectly timed joke that only he was positioned to appreciate. The absurdity of life was quietly unfolding right before him. He realized this was the genius behind Nate Bargatze's comedy, finding the humor hidden ordinary, seemingly insignificant moments. He describes a moment when she sighed while walking past him and paused at the fridge. At first, was this a warning, a critique, or just a sigh? He quickly realized it didn't matter because the humor wasn't in her intent. It was in his reaction. He started timing her actions in his head, narrating them with all the dramatic emphasis of a stand-up set. She opens the fridge, pauses, looks at me, sighs, and I immediately question whether I've been a good human being today. The ordinary became hilarious simply because he noticed it, because he allowed himself to observe and overanalyze, and because he positioned himself as both actor and audience. He notes that the funniest part was how effortless it all was for her. She didn't intend to be funny. She didn't plan it. There were no setups or punchlines. The comedy emerged naturally from the rhythm of life. He just had to slow down enough to see it. He began cataloging each tiny gesture, mentally noting how the tilt of a coffee cup, the placement of a magazine, or the slight shuffle of her feet could all be transformed into material. He realized that this was what made Nate Bargatze so compelling, the ability to see the humor in what everyone else considers mundane. Suddenly, his living room felt like a stage, his wife the director of a subtle, slow burn comedy. Nate talks about observing her interactions not just with objects, but with him. Every minor comment, every glance, every small critique became a teaching moment. She had this way of saying nothing that said everything, and he had to decode it, which added layers to the humor. He realized that marriage was essentially a masterclass in observational comedy. You pay attention if you notice the tiny absurdities and the subtle shifts. You'll see material everywhere. He started internally narrating these moments as if preparing for a set. She walked past me, adjusted the lamp, sighed. In doing so, revealed the hilarious inadequacy of my entire morning routine. So then there was the realization that the humor wasn't just in noticing, it was in experiencing it live, real time. Every reaction he had, every pause, every confused expression added depth to the comedy. Began embracing the role of the observer and the actor simultaneously, understanding that being present in the moment and paying attention to small, ordinary actions was where the true comedic magic lived. And just as he thought he was starting to master this art, she did something completely normal, utterly subtle, and absurdly perfect, reminding him that the comedy in life never stops and that he was still learning the rules. Nate says the next realization hit him when he started internally narrating everything his wife did, turning ordinary moments into a live stand-up routine. He noticed how every action, no matter how small, had potential for comedy if he just slowed down and paid attention. When she opened a cabinet slightly differently than usual, he thought, here comes the next punchline. When she poured a glass of water, he saw the timing, the angle, the subtle gestures, and immediately began framing it in his mind like a joke. She pours water carefully, as if my life depends on it, and I panic because I'm convinced the glass will explode if I look at it wrong. He realized this was Nate Bargatze level observation, the kind that takes ordinary life and stretches it into absurdity without ever forcing it. He explains that narrating life this way changes how you experience it. Suddenly, everything is material. The way she walked across the kitchen floor, the way she sighed while folding laundry, the way she placed the remote slightly askew, all of it became part of a mental script he was constructing for his own amusement and reflection. He started timing her gestures, imagining the comedic effect of each pause, each glance, each minor adjustment. The more he narrated, the funnier it became because he was both participant and audience. Every reaction he had fed the joke, every overreaction became part of the rhythm of comedy that he was slowly learning to appreciate. Notes that the trickiest part is that this comedy isn't loud or obvious. It's subtle, slow, often invisible to anyone else. He started laughing silently to himself in ways that might seem ridiculous if anyone else saw. Observe a tiny shift in the couch pillows and immediately think, yes, the pillows have conspired against me today. See the setup, and the punchline will arrive in exactly 3 minutes. And it wasn't just about the objects, it was about his perception, his mind connecting dots that probably didn't exist, turning them into absurd stories that made him both terrified and delighted. He says the real genius is timing. Comedy is all about timing, and his wife had it naturally. The pauses between actions, the little looks, the slight gestures, They all arrived exactly when they were meant to, creating tension and release that he could only fully appreciate internally. He started imagining the audience, the dog, the cat, the furniture, all silently judging him while he acted out the absurdity of his own life. Realized that Nate Bargatze does this every night on stage, observing the minutiae of life and turning it into a story that everyone can laugh at. Suddenly, he understood how effective it was to slow down and notice. Nate describes a moment when she moved a mug while he was distracted, and he internally narrated, "She moves the mug ever so slightly, and I panic because now the universe is slightly off balance and my entire morning routine is compromised." He laughed at his own overthinking, but also marveled at the subtlety of it all. The comedy wasn't coming from her. It was coming from his reaction to her. The way he noticed and interpreted the ordinary as absurd. And just as he thought he had the rhythm down, she reached for something else, did it in a slightly different way, and he realized the comedy wasn't finished. It was evolving, and he was still the clueless narrator, trapped in an endlessly amusing, subtly orchestrated world. Nate says the final realization hit him when he understood that he wasn't the comedian in this scenario. He was the setup. Every reaction, every overthinking moment, every confused look he gave became the material. And his wife was effortlessly delivering the punchlines without even realizing it. He noticed how her movements, her gestures, even her casual comments created perfect comedic timing. And he was trapped in the middle of it, completely unprepared. He jokes that this is exactly how life works. You think you're in control, you think you're noticing things, but really, you're just part of someone else's masterpiece. The subtlety of it all, the way she walked, the way she paused, the way she adjusted a pillow or moved a mug, was like watching a live comedy special unfold in slow motion. He had a front row seat, whether he liked it or not. Describes a moment when she adjusted the kitchen towel slightly differently than usual. He immediately started overthinking it. He says, "I panicked. I thought, did she do this to send me a message? Is this a critique? Am I failing somehow?" And that's when he realized it didn't matter. The humor was in his reaction, the way he interpreted her tiny gesture as a grand statement, a subtle act loaded with meaning. He began narrating it internally, like a stand-up routine. "She adjusts the towel carefully, and I wonder if my entire life is about to be evaluated based on this one small action." The absurdity of his own overthinking became the comedy. He was both performer and audience, caught in the slow, burn hilarity of normal life. He explains that the beauty of it is how effortless it all is for her. She doesn't plan it, doesn't force it, doesn't even aim to be funny. The comedy emerges naturally because he pays attention and overanalyzes. Every small sigh, every tilt of the head, every glance becomes a layered joke, and he's the unwitting participant, giving it all context and meaning. He starts timing her gestures in his head, anticipating the rhythm of absurdity vaff. Okay, she will move the coaster in 3 seconds, then adjust the remote, then glance at me like she's silently narrating a sitcom episode. He realizes that marriage, when observed closely, is essentially a continuous live comedy routine, and he's the character who makes it all work. Notices that the funniest part is the balance between chaos and control. His wife doesn't overdo it. She's subtle, measured, perfect in her timing, and he responds excessively, panicking, narrating, and overanalyzing. Every step he takes feeds the comedy. Every attempt to correct or adjust something only heightens it. He jokes that he could write a full stand set about this exact moment. She moves a mug 1 inch to the left, and I question everything about my life, and somehow it's hilarious. The juxtaposition of her calm precision and his frantic interpretation creates endless comedy material. He realizes that understanding Nate Bargatze's style is like understanding marriage. It's about noticing, observing, appreciating the absurdity hidden in everyday life. And just as he starts to accept his role as the setup, as the participant in this unintentional comedy, she does something completely normal, perfectly timed, and subtly absurd, reminding him that the punchlines are endless, and he is still learning to navigate this live, unscripted show. So after all of this, I finally get it. I finally understand why Nate Bargatze can make a living talking about life, because marriage is basically the ultimate slow burn comedy special, and I've been living in it all along. Every tiny gesture, every smile, every slightly off-center coaster, it's a punchline waiting to happen. And I'm usually the one falling over it. The funniest part, my wife doesn't even try. She's naturally setting up jokes. I'm the one giving them life with my overthinking, my reactions, my dramatic pauses. I'm like a one-man warm-up act in my own house. I've realized that the beauty of marriage, the true comedy of it, isn't in grand gestures or dramatic arguments. It's in the ordinary, everyday stuff that you barely notice until you're paying attention. And once you do notice it, suddenly life feels like a Nate Bargatze routine, slow, observational, absurd, and ridiculously relatable. I've spent years overanalyzing, panicking, narrating internally, and providing material for the real star of the show, my wife. She's calm, effortless, and perfectly timed. Smart while I'm sweating and narrating every minor movement like it's the season finale of my life. And they're smart, and just when I think I've caught on, she does the next tiny, subtle, perfectly timed thing, and I realize I'm still learning. I'm still the setup. I'm still the audience in silent comedy. And that, my friends, is marriage in its purest, funniest form, one small absurd moment after another, and you just hope you notice them before they pass. And if you do, well, you might finally understand Nate Bargatze too.